She didn't flinch when she hit him. That was the part nobody talked about afterward. Not the slap itself, but the way her hand moved like she'd done it before, like the gesture was already inside her, just waiting. The man she struck didn't move either. He stood outside the entrance of the Rideau Club on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, hands in the pockets of a coat that had seen better years. His name was Callum Serre. He was 34 years old, and he hadn't said a single word to the woman who hit him. 3 weeks earlier, Callum had driven up to Ottawa from Kingston in a truck that belonged to his uncle. He'd been sleeping in the extended cab for 6 nights, showering at the Salvation Army on Argyle, eating at Tim Hortons when he had enough coins. He wasn't homeless in the way the word usually lands. He had a degree from Queen's, a professional designation he'd earned at 26, and a portfolio of work that a former colleague in Vancouver had once described, quietly, as the kind of thing that doesn't come around twice in a generation. But he'd lost his apartment when the firm he worked for dissolved in March. He'd lost most of his savings to a legal dispute he'd had no business fighting alone. And his mother, Odette, had been sick since February, the kind of sick that requires someone nearby, which meant Kingston, which meant starting over. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He'd come to Ottawa because a company called Harlow Capital had posted a position that fit him precisely, and he had an interview scheduled for the following Thursday. He just needed to stretch the money until then. The Rideau Club sits on Wellington Street, the kind of building that doesn't need to announce itself. Callum wasn't trying to go inside. He was standing near the entrance reading the posting a second time on his phone, double-checking the address of the building next door, when the door opened and a woman stepped out. Her name was Frederica Harlow. She was 51 years old, the founder and managing partner of Harlow Capital, and she was wearing a coat that cost more than Callum's truck. She had a phone pressed to her ear and shopping bags in the other hand, and she stopped when she saw him standing there, blocking what she considered to be her path, even though there was plenty of room on either side. "Excuse me," she said, not as a question. Callum stepped aside. She looked at him the way some people look at a stain. "Do you have somewhere to be?" she said. "Because this isn't a place to loiter." He didn't answer. He'd learned a long time ago that some confrontations don't require participation. She stepped past him, and then, for a reason she would struggle to articulate later, not that anyone would ask her to, she turned back and her hand came up, and she slapped him across the left side of his face with an open palm. The sound was flat and sharp in the cold air. A man waiting for a cab near the curb looked up. A woman coming out of the building behind Frederica stopped with her hand on the door. A young assistant, barely 20, who had been trailing Frederica at a polite distance, went completely still on the sidewalk and stared at his shoes. Callum didn't raise his hands. He didn't step back. He looked at her with an expression that wasn't anger and wasn't humiliation and wasn't anything she could name, and then he turned and walked away down Wellington. Frederica adjusted her coat. She resumed her phone call. She got into the waiting car. The assistant, whose name was Owen Cherist, stood on the sidewalk for a long moment after the car pulled away. He'd been with Harlow Capital for 11 months. He thought he'd seen everything. He pressed his lips together and took out his own phone and took a photo of the man walking away, because something in him, some instinct he couldn't explain, said he should. Callum's interview was in 9 days. He didn't tell anyone what had happened outside the Rideau Club. He went back to his truck, sat in the parking lot of a Loblaws on Carling Avenue, and stared at the dashboard for a while. His cheek hurt. He touched it once. Then he pulled out his laptop and worked on his presentation until his battery died. His mother called that evening from the hospital in Kingston. She'd had a good day, she said. The nurses were kind. She asked if he was eating. "I'm fine, Mom," and he said, "I'm doing fine." He wasn't entirely. But he wasn't broken either, which he supposed was something. Odette Serre had raised Callum alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Côte-des-Neiges neighborhood of Montreal. She'd worked as a cleaning supervisor at a hotel on Sherbrooke for 23 years. She was Haitian-born, stubborn as iron, and she'd instilled in her son 2 things above everything else: the ability to work without recognition, and the discipline never to let anyone see him bleed. She'd also taught him the difference between revenge and correction. Revenge, she told him when he was 12 and had come home with a split lip from a boy who didn't like the way he spoke French, is when you make someone feel what you felt. Correction is when you make it impossible for them to do it again. Callum had never forgotten the distinction. He'd spent most of his 20s in Vancouver, working in infrastructure finance, the unglamorous side of capital markets, the side that builds water treatment facilities and hospital wings and affordable transit corridors in cities that couldn't otherwise afford them. He was exceptionally good at it. He could look at a funding model for a long-term care facility and find structural inefficiencies that other analysts missed entirely. He had a memory for rates, for covenants, for the kinds of bureaucratic choke points that kill projects before they break ground. He'd come to the attention of a partner at a mid-sized firm in Vancouver who'd described him, in an email Callum had never been meant to see, as the best infrastructure analyst I've worked with in 20 years. But, and there it was, always a but, not quite the face we put in the room with clients. He'd left that firm the following year, not because of the email, but because of what it confirmed. He'd built a reputation quietly, project by project, and when Harlow Capital posted a senior advisory position focused on public infrastructure in Ontario and Quebec, 3 people in his network had sent him the listing within the same hour. He hadn't known when he applied who ran the firm. The day before the interview, Callum rented a room at a motel on Merivale Road for $48. He pressed his suit with the iron the front desk lent him. He polished his shoes with a cloth he'd been carrying in his bag since Kingston. He reviewed his materials one more time, not because he needed to, but because the ritual of it settled something in him. He didn't sleep well. He thought about his mother. He thought about the woman outside the Rideau Club. He thought about Owen Charest standing on the sidewalk, watching, and he wondered what the young man had made of it. He arrived at Harlow Capital's offices on Queen Street 11 minutes early. The receptionist offered him coffee. He accepted and sat in a low chair near the window and watched the street below. The first interview was with a director named Simon Lacroix, who had a methodical, probing quality that Callum respected. They talked about a transit project in Brampton for 40 minutes. Simon leaned back at one point and said, frankly, that the analysis Callum had submitted with his application had been the most sophisticated they'd received for the position. I want to be honest with you, Simon said. We had a strong internal candidate. But what you put together changed the conversation. Callum nodded. He didn't perform modesty and he didn't perform confidence. He just answered the next question. Then the door opened. Frederica Harlow walked in, apologizing for her lateness, already looking at the file in her hands, and she sat across from Callum at the table and looked up, and the expression on her face traveled through several distinct phases in approximately 2 seconds. Recognition, confusion, something she quickly sealed over. Mr. Serre, she said. Miss Harlow, he said. Simon Lacroix looked between them. You've met? Briefly, Callum said. He didn't look away from her outside the Rideau Club a few weeks ago. Frederica's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I don't, she stopped. She looked at the file again. Callum waited. Let's proceed, she said. The interview lasted another hour. Frederica asked precise, demanding questions, and Callum answered every one of them without hesitation. He walked them through a refinancing model for a long-term care facility in Sudbury that had been stalled in approvals for 2 years. He identified 3 covenant structures that would satisfy the provincial lender and still leave room for a private equity co-investor. Simon Lacroix took notes with the focused energy of someone who already knew what he was going to recommend. Frederica said very little in the second half. She watched Callum the way you watch something that doesn't behave the way you expected. When it was over, Simon shook Callum's hand warmly. Frederica shook it as well, briefly, and her hand was cold. Owen Charest had been in the building that afternoon. He'd seen Callum come in and recognized him immediately. The coat, the unhurried way he moved, the stillness. He'd said nothing to anyone. He'd gone back to his desk and sat with his hands flat on the surface and breathed for a moment. That evening, he sent an anonymous message to a journalist he knew at the Ottawa Citizen. He attached the photo he'd taken outside the Rideau Club. He wrote 4 sentences. He didn't send it yet. He sat with it in his drafts folder and thought about what it would cost him and what it would cost the man in the photo if he did nothing. He left it in drafts for now. Odette Serre died on the 22nd of November. She died at 11 in the morning, with Callum beside her and a nurse named Bridget who had been kind to her for weeks. The room had a window that faced a courtyard where someone had planted a mountain ash tree, and the last light she ever saw was coming through the branches, orange and pale, moving slightly in the November wind. Callum drove back to Ottawa 3 days later because he didn't know what else to do with himself, and because the work was the only thing that held its shape when everything else went formless. Harlow Capital had sent a formal offer letter while he was still in Kingston. The salary was serious. The mandate was exactly what he'd spent a decade training for. He accepted by email 2 hours after the funeral. He didn't tell them why the response had taken 4 days. It wasn't their business, and it was not the kind of thing Odette would have wanted him to use as explanation. He started on a Monday in December, in a corner office on the 9th floor that overlooked the canal. It was a good office. He hadn't asked for it. Simon Lacroix had simply shown him to it matter-of-factly, as though there had never been any other option. Frederica Harlow was rarely in the office those first weeks. When she was professional and brisk, and she didn't look at him for longer than necessary. The staff liked Callum quickly, the way people like someone who does the work without theater. He brought coffee to meetings. He remembered people's names. He sent Simon Lacroix a memo after his second week that reorganized the evaluation framework for 2 provincial contracts in a way that saved the firm approximately 6 weeks of back and forth with government liaisons. Simon forwarded the memo to the partnership with a single line. This is what we were looking for. In January, the Sudbury project closed. It was the first infrastructure deal Harlow Capital had successfully closed with provincial co-investment in 3 years. The Globe and Mail ran a short piece about it. Callum's name appeared in the second paragraph. Frederica read the piece at her kitchen table on a Saturday morning. She read Callum's name and she set the paper down and she sat with her coffee for a long time. She had not apologized. She had told herself in the weeks since the interview that the incident on the sidewalk had been a misunderstanding, an overreaction on a stressful afternoon, the kind of moment that exists in a private category separate from everything else. She had told herself he'd been compensated by being hired, as though a job were the correct unit of exchange for what she'd done. She picked up the paper again. She read his name a second time. In March, Callum was asked to lead the firm's presentation at a housing infrastructure summit at the Shaw Centre. It was a significant audience: deputy ministers, municipal finance officers, development executives, people who made decisions about where money went and what got built and who had access to it. He'd been preparing the presentation for 6 weeks. He'd built it around a funding model for mixed-income housing that could be replicated across mid-sized Canadian cities. It was not flashy. It was detailed and precise and genuinely useful, which is a different thing entirely. He was backstage when Frederica found him. "I need a moment," she said. There were people around. He looked at her and then nodded, and they stepped into a hallway off the staging area. She was carrying something, not a document, not a phone, just her hands, folded. She looked, for the first time since he'd known her, like a person who didn't know what to do with herself. "What I did," she said, outside the Rideau Club. She stopped. Callum waited. "I have been trying to find a framing for it that makes sense," she said, "and I can't. There isn't one." She looked at him directly. "I struck you, in public, without provocation. And I have been sitting with that." "All right," he said. "That's all you're going to say?" "What would you like me to say?" She shook her head slightly. "I don't know. Something angrier than that." "My mother used to say that anger is expensive," Callum said. She was a careful woman with money. Frederica was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said. "I mean that without reservation. I'm sorry." He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she didn't look away. "I know," he said. He walked out onto the stage 17 minutes later. The room held perhaps 300 people. He set his notes on the podium, looked out at the audience, and began. He spoke for 38 minutes without reading from his notes once. He spoke about what it costs a city when the people who build it can't afford to live in it. He spoke about covenant structures and provincial transfer payments and the gap between what gets approved in an election year and what actually gets financed. He spoke about his mother's neighborhood in Montreal, just once, briefly, without sentimentality, just as a data point, a real place, the kind of place his model was built to reach. The room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when people stop thinking about their phones. When he finished, the applause started before he'd stepped away from the podium. Owen Charest was in the audience. He'd been invited as a junior representative from the firm, and he sat near the back and watched Callum Serre stand at that podium and deliver 38 minutes of work that had been built, quietly, over 10 years of getting the job done without anyone making space for him. He thought about the photo in his drafts folder. He thought about the sidewalk on Wellington Street in November. He thought about Frederica Harlow's hand moving through the cold air. He deleted the draft that evening, not because it didn't matter, but because the man in that photo was already exactly where he needed to be, and some corrections don't require exposure to be complete. The following September, Harlow Capital announced the launch of a new community infrastructure fund, the first of its kind in Ontario, targeting long-term care facilities, transitional housing, and neighborhood health centers in communities that had historically been passed over by institutional capital. The announcement was made at a small press conference on a Tuesday morning. Callum stood at the edge of the room while Simon Lacroix read the statement. His name appeared on the fund documents as co-architect of the financing structure. A journalist from the CBC asked who the idea had originated with. Simon looked at Callum. Callum looked at the journalist. My mother grew up without access to the kind of care this fund is designed to provide, he said. She spent her life working in a building where people like her didn't exist in the executive suite. She died last November in a hospital room with a mountain ash tree outside the window. He paused. The fund is named after her, Odette. There was a moment of silence that nobody filled. The journalist wrote it down. Frederica Harlow was standing near the back of the room. She had made herself be there. She looked at the man she'd struck on a sidewalk in November, this man who had spent the better part of a year building something real and good and lasting inside her own firm, and she understood, in a way that had nothing to do with business, exactly what she had almost missed. She didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say that the room hadn't already heard. Callum walked out of the press conference into a clear September morning, the canal bright and flat in the sun, the maples just beginning to turn. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed the cold coming in off the water. He thought about his mother. He thought about a mountain ash tree in November moving in the wind. He put his hands in his pockets and walked. I keep thinking about the mountain ash tree. Not the press conference, not the fund, not the moment. Frederica Harlow stood at the back of the room and understood what she'd almost thrown away. I keep thinking about a window in a hospital in Kingston, and a woman who spent her whole life working in buildings where people like her didn't exist above the ground floor, and what it means that her son built something in her name anyway. Callum didn't win because the universe balanced a ledger. He won because he refused to let what was done to him on a sidewalk in November become the thing that defined what he did next. That's not luck. That's not karma in any mystical sense. That's a choice, made quietly, every single day, in a motel room on Merivale Road with a borrowed iron and a suit that still had to be pressed. I think about that a lot, the borrowed iron. There's a version of this story where Callum goes home after the slap and lets it hollow him out, where the grief of losing his mother, the humiliation on Wellington Street, the years of being the best analyst in rooms that still didn't make space for him, where all of that compounds into something that closes a person down. Most people wouldn't blame him for that. I wouldn't. But the thing about integrity, real integrity, not the word on a motivational poster, is that it doesn't ask whether you've been treated fairly before it shows up. Callum didn't press his suit because he felt like it. He pressed it because the work deserved it, and because Odette raised him to understand that how you carry yourself when no one is watching is the only character you actually have. That's the part I find hardest and most worth holding on to. And then there's Owen, 20 years old, standing on a sidewalk, watching something happen that he didn't cause and couldn't undo. He took a photo because something in him said he should. He sat with that photo in his drafts folder for months, weighing what it would cost him, what it would cost the man in it. In the end, he deleted it. Not because it didn't matter, but because he understood that Callum didn't need saving. He needed room. That kind of clarity at 20 in a job you can't afford to lose. I don't take that lightly. What I keep coming back to is this. Callum Serre walked into that summit and spoke for 38 minutes without notes, and the room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when someone is saying something true. He didn't get there by being given anything. He got there by knowing exactly what he was building and refusing to let anyone's contempt redirect the foundation. The Odette Fund exists because a woman cleaned hotel rooms on Sherbrooke Street for 23 years and taught her son that correction outlasts revenge. That knowledge passed from her hands to his, through a coat that had seen better years, Through a parking lot in Ottawa, through grief and cold and the particular silence of a November morning when you have nowhere left to go but forward. I think that's what stays with me. Not the ending, the forward.